In the United States, it's never really a big surprise to hear about a political scandal in the news, but every once in a while a story will come along that begs to be paid attention to, like the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. Supreme Court justices are usually less problematic than presidents and Congress members, so when a story about sexual assault allegations against the new Supreme Court nominee broke, people paid attention, and an even larger conversation about sexual assault was initiated. So what exactly happened with these hearings, and why were they important? How did the media handle this huge story, and how did the country act? This is what we are going to be talking about today. In July of 2018, President Trump announced his nomination for the empty Supreme Court justice seat, conservative judge Brett Kavanaugh. This was a big deal because it meant that if he was confirmed, the Supreme Court would sway in a more conservative way. But soon after his nomination was announced, Christine Blasey Ford, a professor at Palo Alto University, came forward with allegations that 36 years ago, a drunk and 17-year-old Kavanaugh tried to force himself on her at a high school party and groped her while his friends watched. These allegations, plus several other allegations of sexual misconduct and sexual assault attempts, led to a hearing in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee in September of 2018 to decide whether to vote to confirm Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court or not. After this highly politicized and covered hearing in which both Ford and Kavanaugh testified, Kavanaugh was still confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court on a 50-48 vote. Now, Brett Kavanaugh has been on the Supreme Court for almost 2 years, voting mostly conservative as expected, swaying Supreme Court decisions on hot-button topics such as abortion in a conservative way. In September of 2019, actually, new allegations of another incident of sexual misconduct at a college party came forward in a New York Times essay, but these allegations were criticized by many Republicans for being uncorroborated, while many Democrats in Congress called for Kavanaugh's impeachment. Since then, the discussion has mostly calmed down, but still, the hearings in 2018 are discussed by many when it comes to talking about the bigger picture of our current political environment, where even our president has had many sexual misconduct allegations pointed his way. This is an important news event to understand and know because it can be helpful in understanding the current political climate we live in. And it is another nail in the coffin when it comes to the many problems of how we handle and discuss sexual assault. It is in being informed about these types of upsetting events that we can demand more for our country and for the way our democracy is run. This was a very big story when it broke in 2018, largely because it added another voice to the Me Too movement in a strong and unwavering Christine Blasey Ford. In some ways, the story was very sensationalized, and news outlets covered the hearings as if it was dramatic entertainment. But, to be fair, the hearings were very dramatic and went more like a typical court case than a judiciary hearing. Despite all the drama, though, I found that most news outlets actually did a good job of just putting the facts out there of what happened. There were many articles in which the timeline and accusations are broken down in easy ways to understand, because there was so much going around. On the other side of this, there was also big coverage on the story from a more feminist lens that used the story to reinvigorate the conversation surrounding sexual assault, and many discussed the impacts this had on the Me Too movement. As one might expect from a controversial and partisan event like this, the public reaction to the story was very much split on partisan lines. Those more conservative reacted in outrage to the accusations, coming to Kavanaugh's defense and even going as far to make fun of Ford and her accusations, which were led by President Trump himself. On the other side, more liberal people reacted in support for Ford and believed her accusations, instead acting in outrage against Kavanaugh. During the hearings, there were many protests from sexual assault survivors, and many reacted positively to Ford's story relating to her fears and her not coming forward as soon as it happened. The hashtag #WhyIDidn'tReport even started trending, where many people told their own stories of sexual assault experiences and why they didn't report. When the story first came out, my own personal reaction was first confusion about what was going on, because it was very hard to get the straight facts right away, and also outrage that a person who was supposed to be a Supreme Court justice would always have these major accusations hanging over him in a way that would make it hard for me to trust him and trust his character and his decisions. Based on these mixed reactions to this story, it's easy to see that where we get our news from can impact how we receive the story, because partisan news outlets will shape the narrative. So it's sometimes hard for us to trust the exactness of the stories we are hearing. A story like this shows how there can be two very different sides to a story, in this case, Ford's versus Kavanaugh's. And sometimes, even if a person reads all the facts, it won't matter because they're going to side with their own personal beliefs no matter what. I think the confusion reaction that happened does show that sometimes news outlets over-dramatize stories, which makes it hard for audiences to get the facts and make their own decisions about what's happening. While we oftentimes probably think that what goes on in places like the Supreme Court aren't important to our everyday life, the truth is that they are important, which is why the Brett Kavanaugh hearings was an important story to be covered by news outlets. As informed and invested citizens, we should care about and know about what's going on in places like the Supreme Court, and we need to know about the justices who are supposed to be supporting our democracy by upholding the Constitution. This story is also an important one to be covered because it's really a part of a bigger conversation about sexual assault and gender politics in our country. When a Supreme Court justice is a man who's been accused of sexual assault, along with a president who passes off misogynistic comments as locker room talk, it is time for a conversation to be had. So the media covering stories like this is very important. While the sometimes over-dramatization of this story could have and should have been avoided by news outlets, I think for the most part, this story was covered well by most news outlets. Overall, I think that during the hearings themselves, the media was chaotic, but afterwards they did a good job of really getting the facts out there in articles such as a CNN timeline that really breaks down the hearings. Just like all other political stories, news coverage can get messy, and in this story it did. But for the most part, I think news outlets were pretty responsible in how they covered the story. In 2018, when the story that Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh had been accused of sexual assault broke, the country paid attention. And even after hearings about the accusations took place and Kavanaugh was confirmed as a Supreme Court Justice, the media continued to discuss the story, somewhat dramatically, as it inspired many bigger conversations about sexual assault. With a somewhat partisan news coverage and a very partisan public reaction, the country was abuzz about this story, and the questions it raised about the trust we should put in our leaders and how we should handle sexual assault are still important questions 2 years later. In the Me Too era, this was not the first high-profile sexual assault story, and it certainly won't be the last. But it's stories like this that should inspire us to have conversations about big problems like sexual assault and our rape culture, and it's up to the mass media to cover these stories truthfully and help in starting those conversations. Thank you.